Good evening. We are here tonight with a fascinating gentleman, Joe Moalem, who has in his long and fruitful life had the opportunity to see the world from many different perspectives. We will follow his migration from China, his place of birth in 1905, to England, then to Canada, and finally to the United States. Joe, I understand that you were born in Shanghai, but that both of your parents originated from other places in the world. First, let's talk about your father. Where was he born, and how did he come to be in China?
He was born in Aden, and I think he jumped ship in China, and he stayed there.
And he stayed there. How did he meet your mother?
Well, my mother was born in Iraq, and the whole family had moved to India, to Pune. And from there, her mother and my mother came to China. And this is where my father met her in the temple. And this is where they got to know each other. And later on, they got married.
What type of work did your father do?
He was a beadle in the temple.
Is that like a shamus?
Like a shamus, yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the Jewish life in Shanghai at that time.
Well, at that time, as far as I can remember, there was a very big Jewish community. The first Jewish community was mostly Sephardic. And later on, the Ashkenazis came when there was a revolution in Russia. They gradually gravitated from Siberia into Harbin, from Harbin to Dairen, and from Dairen to Tientsin, Tientsin to Shanghai. And then there was a big community of them in Shanghai. And then there was two groups of Jews, the Sephardic and the Ashkenazim.
It's very interesting. How large a family did you come from?
Well, we have 5 brothers and 2 sisters.
What do you remember about your family life in Shanghai?
Well, we came from very, very humble folks. We never had much money. My father made a living. I mean, we had enough to live on, but nothing to, say, spend lavishly on. And we lived very quietly, and there was nothing much to do in China anyway. I mean, just was home life. We never went out. My father was 100% kosher, so we never ate outside. Everything was cooked at home. So that's the way we lived. There was no going out to restaurants and things like that, because my father was very strict as far as kosher was concerned.
What kind of a career did you seek?
I mean,
Yes.
Well, my brother, who was working in a big English department store, he was an accountant there, and he wanted me to be sort of help him in his work, and I never liked that kind of work, so I wanted to be an engineer.
And did you in fact become an engineer?
And I got a correspondence course, and then I went later on to the shipyards where I took up mechanical engineering, and later on, after 5 years, I went to sea. I didn't complete my engineering because at that time, when I took the correspondence course from the United States, there was no planes to bring the results in a hurry. They had to come out by ship, and the ship took about 20 days to come out from, say, San Francisco to Shanghai. So I couldn't wait that long, so I gave it up and studied on my own, and I got my graduation as an engineer from Hong Kong government.
And did you gain employment with a particular company?
Yes, I worked with Jardine Matheson, one of the biggest companies in the Far East today. It's a multi-billion company. They practically own half of Hong Kong. I was in the Merchant Marine for them for 26 years.
You told me something interesting about the company. They had special types of things about their vacations after
yes.
work.
Well, during your service on these ships, you never got any vacation. But every 5 years, you got 9 months vacation with full pay, and travel to wherever you wanted to go. Most of them went to England. Well, I had no interest in England, so as my wife's mother was in America, and my brother was in America, I used to come to San Francisco every 5 years. Everything was paid for, so there was no problem as far as travel was concerned.
You mentioned your wife. How was your meeting with your wife arranged?
Oh, the way I met my wife was I arrived one day in Shanghai, and I loved dancing, foxtrot and waltz, old-fashioned dancing, none of this crazy dancing you get nowadays. And I asked this agent whether he knew any girl in Shanghai, and oh yes, he says he knew a girl, but he didn't know whether she could speak English. So he gave me her address, and she was working at Brothers Pharmacy in the French concession. So I very bravely went up there and looked inside the pharmacy, and I could see that she was presentable, and I went in there and I asked her, but she couldn't speak a word of English. So her brother, the pharmacist, could speak a few words of English, and I asked her whether she'd like to go out with me, and she said, well, after a while she thought about it, and she said yes. So I said, okay, let's go out. So she went home, I waited in the pharmacy, she went home and got changed, and then we went out to for dinner and a nightclub. And the nightclubs in Shanghai were different to nightclubs here. They went all night. I mean, till 10 o'clock in the morning. And we spent a wonderful night. And then the next trip I came back. We went out with some friends of hers, about 3 more couples, and we gradually got to know each other, and we got married.
Tell me a little bit about her background.
My background was...
No, Hannah's background.
Oh, well, she was a refugee from Russia, and when she came to Shanghai, she worked at a Russian tailoring, you know, it's what you call it, sweatshop, Russian sweatshop, you know, making clothes. They had to make a living because that's the only way they could live. And then she worked in her brother's drugstore.
What were the circumstances of your wedding?
Oh, our wedding was about the most curious, funniest thing in the world. At that time, there was a lot of friction between the two communities, the Sephardic communities and the Ashkenazi community. And naturally, she being Ashkenazi, she preferred to have an Ashkenazi wedding. I had no objection. The wedding is a wedding. It's conducted by a rabbi, so it doesn't matter whether the rabbi was Ashkenazi or Sephardic. So we went to the Ashkenazi community and told them that we would like to get married. And of course, they said, no girl can marry a Sephardic. So the idea was that they had friction and they would not let us do it, you see. So we went to the Sephardic and they said, no, you can't marry an Ashkenazi. So we were in a dilemma as to what to do. And my thought was we'd go, as I was British by birth, I'd go to the British consulate and get married there. And just then, fortunately, a rabbi came from London, an English rabbi, and of course he had no access to grind with either side, so he said, why not? He says, as long as both of you are Jewish, there's no objections to getting married. And so we got married in the synagogue, the synagogue. Of course, my father had passed away. And we got married there, and we lived happily ever after.
When you and Hannah started a family, did you have a girl or a boy first?
We had a boy. The first child was a boy. I wasn't there at the birth of the child. I was at sea. I came back 2 days later, and I saw the child. She was breastfeeding it, and when I came back the next trip, she told me that the child had died, and we couldn't understand because the baby was healthy. There was nothing wrong with it, and there was no way we could find out what caused the baby to die until a couple of years later. Somebody who worked as a nurse in the hospital told us about it, that they dropped the child.
Right.
And this affected my wife terribly. She was actually getting very nervous and getting out of her mind, losing that child. And so we had another child, and Sophie was born. And that sort of calmed her down, and things became normal again.
Did you have any children after Sophie?
Yes, William. Sophie was about, I think, 3 years of age, and my wife became pregnant again, and war was impending. So I didn't know what to do with her because I didn't know I probably wouldn't see her. Being in the Merchant Marine, I probably had to go away. So I said to her, you better go to the States. Your mother is there. Her mother, in the meantime, had emigrated there. and stay with your mother, and if a child is born there, why, you'll be safe, and when I get my vacation, I'll come over to the States. Well, William was born here in San Francisco at Mount Zion Hospital, and when I got my vacation, I came back. The war hadn't broken out then, although the Japanese were doing a lot of things in China.
So you came to San Francisco?
Yes.
Came to San Francisco?
I came to San Francisco, and when my time was up to go back, I told her to stay here because then war was definitely threatening, and I was sure it was going to be war. But she kept on crying. She wanted to go back to China with me, and she had been separated for so long. And I said, well, you know, it's very dangerous to go back. Well, she said, I'll take the danger, whatever comes out of it. She said, we want to be together. And we had a hard time getting a ship out of here. But we managed to get a ship. It took us to Honolulu. And there we had to change to another ship. We spent about a week in Honolulu. And from there we went to Manila. And from Manila we went to Hong Kong. I didn't go ashore to the head office there because I didn't want them to call me. So we went down to Shanghai, and there I reported to my office in Shanghai. So we refurnished the home, bought some furniture, and got a nice small apartment. They have beautiful apartments there. Furnished it all, and I stayed there, I think, 2 weeks before I was called to go back to work. And my first job was to get down to Hong Kong, so I went down as a passenger to Hong Kong and joined my ship there. Well, war was only about 10 days away, and I was worried about her. And the company offered me a job in Singapore as engineer commander of a small gunboat. I refused it. I didn't believe in the Navy. Yes sir, no sir business. I said no, I wouldn't take the job. And then word was coming along, the Japanese fleet was coming down. They were started off about halfway down to Hong Kong from Japan. So we pulled out of Hong Kong. We were loaded and we pulled out of Hong Kong. We carried a few passengers on board the ship. And we had an old lady, and every day she used to sit on the port side of the ship. And we were going south, so the port side is the east side where the sun always just comes down. She sat every day till about noon, has a coffee there, and we would go halfway to Singapore when at midnight word came that Pearl Harbor was bombed. So the captain opened the private sealed envelope. I told him that we had to proceed to the nearest country for safety. And of course, we were not very far from Manila, about a day's run from Manila. So the ship turned around and we were heading to Manila. And this old lady, she got up in the morning, she went to her usual seat, and she couldn't understand why there was no sun. She saw there was cloudless sky, but there was no sun. And we kept the joke away from her that there was something wrong. The sun must have moved the wrong side of the ship, you see. It wasn't until the next day we told her that, of course she'd be nervous, you know. We told her that we were heading for Manila. She wanted to know why we said Pearl Harbor. The Japanese said Pearl Harbor, and we were going to Manila for safety. So we got to Manila. And all the ships in that area, that was in that ocean at that time, they all went to the nearest port. That was Manila. There was French ships and English ships and you name them, Dutch ships. And we stayed in Manila about 9 days. In the meantime, we were trying to get word from London what they were going to do with the ships, the British ships that were in Manila. And the first thing they said, well, first they get down to Indonesia. Then from there we'll decide what's going to happen to the ships. So off went to Indonesia. On the way south, the American fleet was running away from the Japanese fleet. They were going south through Balikpapan, that's a channel going into Indonesia, and they met the Japanese fleet coming up this channel, and there was a battle royal. The Americans sunk their Japanese destroyer there, but the Americans were badly battered. They had a lot of casualties, killed and wounded, and they headed down to Indonesia, and the dead was buried there, and the sick was taken to the hospitals. In the meantime, we couldn't get down to Indonesia because we were running short of bunker oil. So we called into Borneo there, Balikpapan, and we bunkered there, filled up the ship with about 500 tons of oil, and the steward went ashore to buy provisions. And of course, you know, it's all native villages, so the only thing you could buy was live chickens and live pigs and live vegetables. And he brought about 500 chickens on board and about 6 pigs, live pigs, and they put them on the poop. And next day there was slaughter going back and putting all these chickens into the freezer and the meat into the freezer. And then we got to Batavia, into Indonesia, and we stayed there for a few days, and waiting for orders from London to what they're going to do with the ship. First, we were supposed to go to Australia. Christmas was about Christmas time. The Dutch there were very, very nice to all the ships that were in port. They brought out Christmas cakes and gifts for the ship's officers, you know, and the crew.
Did you know at this time what your wife's situation was?
No, I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know what happened to her. And from there, we waited about 10 days, and we were supposed to go to Australia, and we were ready to go, and they changed plans. We had to go to Singapore. The Japanese were just not very far from Singapore. They were in Kota Baru, just a few miles, and of course the stupidity of the British. They had all the guns in a fixed position facing the ocean. They never thought the Japanese were going to come from the land. They thought the Japanese were going to come from the sea. And those guns couldn't be turned around. And of course, the Japanese came from Kota Baru through the straits there. They captured Singapore. But before they captured Singapore, we were the last ship to leave Singapore. We were loaded with the most expensive cargo in the world. That was tin ingots. Tin is most expensive at that time, and rubber. We needed rubber in England very, very badly. So we were loaded with tin and rubber. And just before we were to leave, the Japanese were just a few miles from Singapore. They had to get rid of the English population from there. And of course, there was priorities. Women with 6 children had priority, and they came down to women with 5 children, and women with 4 children, and down to women with 1 children, and then the women with no children. Then came the old men, and it worked down. Now, we were into passenger ship. So, I mean, we were only carrying normally 12 passengers, but we put awnings on the deck, and they had to sleep on deck all the way. And of course, it was a very uncomfortable situation. We were going into submarine-infested waters, and the ship got torpedoed. It wasn't a case of women and children first. There were hundreds of them. How many women can you save? But fortunately, it took us 15 days. We went further south and down the Indian Ocean to get away from the submarine area, assumed to be a submarine area. And then normally it would take about 4 days to get to India. It would take about 10 days. And I can tell you, we were glad to
get there.
Get there and get rid of the passengers. A lot of children were seasick. A lot of women were sick. A lot of men were sick on the ship. I gave up most of the officers gave up their rooms to the sick people. We slept on deck. Of course, it was summertime in the ocean, so there was no problem. Just by pulling the blankets out and sleeping on deck. And we went to Calcutta.
How close were you to the Japanese fleet?
Well, the Japanese fleet wasn't in the ocean yet. They were still in Singapore. They hadn't come out into the Indian Ocean. The Japanese submarines were in the Indian Ocean. We could hear ships being torpedoed. Luckily, we weren't torpedoed. We just got to Calcutta in time and got rid of these passengers. Then the ships that arrived, they were all on the run, as a matter of fact. Then they sent us to Burma. The Japanese were coming into Burma. And we arrived in Burma, the same old story, to take all the refugees away. And the Japanese were not very far. The warehouses were all open. The natives were stealing everything out of the warehouses on the wharfs. And
so you collected all the British.
We collected all the British people there, and as many as we could, and we took them to India, at Calcutta. So we stayed in Calcutta for about a month. There was chaos in England. They didn't know what to do with the ships or where to go, you know, after the sudden war. And then, next thing we knew, they were told we had to go to Bombay. And the first 10 ships were left Calcutta. They had to go down to the Hooghly. It's about 75 miles out the river down to the ocean. Well, that first went down, no convoy, they all went down together, 10 ships. And then we were the next 10 ships to go down. And I don't know, God must have been good to us. We were the only ship, when we got halfway down that river, we were told to turn back and go back to Calcutta. Well, that convoy went there, and the Japanese fleet caught them off Madras, and they sunk about 3 ships.
Oh, dear.
So we stayed in Calcutta another 10 days, and then we were told we had to go. So that was the next 10 ships had to go, so we were left. And we made it safely to around India, to the west side of India, to Bombay. And then we stayed there. In the meantime, the Japanese were attacking the east coast of India. They sunk the British aircraft carrier and not a destroyer, bigger than a destroyer. Anyway, they sank a battleship, and the aircraft carrier, the Hermes, was sunk in the Indian Ocean. And most of the ocean was infested by Japanese submarines at that time. Anyway, when we got to Bombay, we stayed there for a while until we could hear what they wanted to do with the ships. Of course, London didn't know what was going on in the Middle East or the Far East at that time, you know. So eventually they decided that we should be taking stuff to Russia through the back door. So our run was Africa, Durban, Ceylon, Bombay, Karachi, and up the Persian Gulf, and we'd end up in Basra. And we took an awful lot of stuff to Russia through the back door. At that time, the Middle East, Iran was the place where the Americans had assembly plants for assembling trucks. They had an assembly plant for assembling planes for Russia. And every day they'd assemble 100 trucks. And every day they'd load the 100 trucks, and these trucks were driven right over the mountains in Iran until they got to Russia on the other side. And from there, the Russians would take over. Douglas aircraft were being built there. And they had Russian women pilots to accept these planes. Before, the Russians never took anything unless it was running perfectly. They had Russian women pilots who take those planes after they'd been assembled, take them for a test flight, and then they used to fly them to Russia across the border. And when they got across the border, they used to arm them. They weren't allowed to be armed leaving Iran, the Iranian country. They had to be armed once they got into Russia. From there, they went straight to the battlefield. Well, we were there most of the time on that route, Basra all the way down to Cape Town. And
when were you informed about the fate of your family and your children?
Oh, I never heard from my family for a long time. I knew probably she was, I heard, you know, you hear talks going on that all the British and all the French and were put in the camps, prison camps. And I didn't know what camp she was, so somebody says, why don't you write to the Red Cross in Switzerland? Maybe they can contact your wife. So I wrote a letter just telling her where I was, what was happening to me, not to worry about me, but I was very worried about her. And she should write to the Red Cross with my address, which was in India at that time. So after about 6 months, I got a letter that she was in a prison camp.
Japanese prison camp?
A Japanese prison camp. They had about 15 camps all over Shanghai and up the river too. And she and the 2 children were in camp.
What were the conditions in the camp like?
At one time, of course, the men and women and children were all together, you know, and of course there was a lot of friction and a lot of shenanigans going on. And my wife was inclined that way. She had the 2 children, and my company was trying to be nice to her. They used to send her, I think, $100 every month. But the $100 couldn't buy anything because there was nothing to buy. But later on, her brother was living in Shanghai. He was, of course, Russian, so he wasn't touched. And once in a while, he used to sneak in a parcel over the fence, you know. He couldn't send very much, just a little bit of sugar, maybe, some candies for the kids, and a couple of cans of sardines and things like that. He was very, very nice to her. And he wasn't allowed to visit her, you know. So she stayed there for 5 years.
It's a long time.
And I never saw her in that time. I sent all my pay to Switzerland through the Red Cross to be sent to her because I was living on war bonus on the ship. Well, I didn't have much expenses, you know. I had the war bonus was more or less buying booze and going to show to have a dinner once in a while. And so all my pay was going up to Switzerland and to be sent to her, and she never got it. The Japanese never gave it to them. There was a lot of people were doing the same thing and never got the money. Of course, I got the money back after the war from the Swiss government. You know, they kept the money there.
When the Japanese finally did surrender, what role did your brother play in reuniting you with your wife and your children?
We were supposed to invade Malaya. The Japanese were on the verge of losing the war, and they were very strong in Malaya. We were supposed to go invade Malaya, and we were the supply ship to the fleet that was going in there. But just as the fleet went in there, Japan surrendered. So that released us. So we went to Hong Kong. Of course, I was trying to get in touch with my wife in Shanghai, but I couldn't contact her. There was no mail, everything was chaos. So my brother was in the American Air Force. He was in the bombers, B-17s. He was rear gunner of the B-bombers. And he was in Japan. And I let him know that my wife was a prisoner of war in Shanghai. So somehow he was a bit of a wangler. He wangled a free trip to Shanghai, and you know the planes were going backwards and forwards. So he went to the airport there, and the military plane was going to Shanghai. I said, "Well, give me a ride." He'd jump in there. Everybody was doing it, you see. And so he got to Shanghai and met my wife and children, and he managed to wangle her a trip to Hong Kong. So, but they couldn't go to Hong Kong. They landed up in Canton, and they came down by train. So he wanted to get a hotel. Hotel accommodation was very difficult. So he went to the most expensive hotel in Hong Kong. And it was on the Kowloon side, and he was in uniform, of course, and he asked for a room. He says no, they wouldn't give him a room. So after all, he put pressure on them, and they managed to give him a room. They put my wife and 2 children there. And then the next day, he contacted my office, and they told me that my ship was in port. But you couldn't get away till about 10 o'clock at night, you see, so a motorboat chugged alongside my ship and knocked on my door, and I opened the door, and there was my brother. Well, I was glad to see him, so we sat down, had a couple of drinks, and I told him, he says, I got your wife here in Hong Kong. I said, no. I said, you're kidding. He says, yeah, they're staying at the Peninsula Hotel. That's a big hotel in Hong Kong, the Peninsula. So I said, no, you're kidding. I said, you know. He says, sure. So we got in the motorboat. We ordered the motorboat. They have little chugging motorboat, so I got ashore, and we got into the hotel. Of course, he went to the military camp, and I went to see my wife. And my son didn't recognize me at all. My daughter recognized me. My son didn't recognize me.
How old was your son when he had last seen you?
He was about 6 or 7, I think.
And he'd been how old when you had left?
Oh, about 5 years.
Had been 5 years since you'd been away.
So we kissed and hugged and went down, had a cup of tea, and I had to get back to the ship because we were sailing next day. So I told her to stay in the hotel and contact my company, and they'd find her quarters. So we left to Bangkok for a load of rice to take to our Japanese friends in Japan. Japanese were starving. So we loaded a cargo of rice in Bangkok, Thailand, and we came to Hong Kong, and I saw her again, and I went up to Japan and came back. In the meantime, I applied for this money that I was sending to her right for 5 years. Right. It was quite a sum of money.
Money, surely.
So we managed to buy a home, not buy a home, but you pay key money, you know.
Right.
So we paid $10,000 key money. We got a beautiful home up the hill in Hong Kong. And she lived there. And when vacation came, I took my vacation, we came to America.
Well, what happened to your mother upon her release from the camps?
The what?
Your mother. She was also in the camps.
My mother was a prisoner of war. And we were in the meantime, my brothers and sister were all prisoners of war. And when the war was over, they couldn't stay in China. They had to go somewhere, and they didn't want to go back to England. And they had the offer to go to Australia. And all the British that wanted to go to Australia were sent to Australia. But my mother was sick because she couldn't go. So she stayed in Shanghai for a while. And one day I came back, I think I came back from Calcutta, India. We just arrived in Hong Kong, and a friend of mine and my wife he was a very good friend of ours because he was kicked by the Japanese in the head and he was half blind. And he came to live with my wife. My wife had a spare room. He was very sick and my wife nursed him to health. And he came on the ship, he says, by the way, your mother's on the ship just arrived from Shanghai.
Mm-hmm.
So I got into my civilian clothes, and I thought, well, I'll go and visit my mother and see what's going on. The ship was going to stay a couple of days in Hong Kong. So I got to the gangway, and there was a military man at the gangway. He would let me go up. And I told him, I said, my mother, no, he says, you can't go up on the ship. He says, so I said, okay, fine, I'll fix you up. So I went back to my ship, I put on my uniform with 4 gold braids, and I came to the gangway. He saluted me, and I walked up the ship, you see, and found my mother there. She was very ill, and I didn't think that it was safe enough for her to make the trip to Australia, so I got hold of the officials on the ship and told them that they had to send my mother to a hospital. So they said, okay, fine. So they took her and put her in a military hospital. Well, she stayed there a couple of days. Lucky I was there 3 days. And the military hospital wasn't what I expected it to be. Of course, military. So we managed to move her to a civilian hospital. The civilian hospital was miles away. But transport was very difficult. So we had to walk about 5 miles to get to the hospital. And of course, food was very scarce. Oranges and eggs were very scarce. So we managed to wangle somehow to get oranges and eggs. You can always get them in the black market. So we used to buy them and take them up to the hospital. But I couldn't stay. I had to leave. We went up to Japan. So my wife and my good friend, I was still with my wife. They used to go there every day and see my mother and comfort her, you see. And in the meantime, we went up to Japan, and I thought, well, seeing I'm here, I'll go and see Hiroshima. So I got on a train, and I went to see Hiroshima where they dropped the bomb. Tell you what devastation, you've never seen anything in your life.
Really?
Of course, a lot of people are bitter about Hiroshima. I'm not. We've saved 500,000 American lives. If they had to attack Japan, we would have lost 500,000 American men.
It was something that needed to be done.
Something that needed to be done. The Japanese wasn't going to surrender.
No.
And the atrocities committed by the Japanese in China was awful. The rape of Nanking was something unbelievable. They killed millions. They just threw them down in pits, and Japanese soldiers there, when they were bayoneted, and just bayoneted them. They call what they call blooding the troops, so that the troops could fight, And I went to see Hiroshima. It was terrible to see, but it saved 500,000 American lives, which was more important, I think.
I absolutely agree with you.
That's the way I feel. I don't know what other people feel about it.
After the war was over, where did you settle?
Well, after the war was over, I decided when my time came to retire, I'd retire. I was only 55 or 56, I think. And I went to the company. I said, well, I've done my 25 years. I want to retire. And
but you still stayed in. 1945, when the war was over, you still stayed for another 10 years with the company.
Yes, I stayed with them until I reached my retiring age.
Right.
Well, not retiring. I was still a young man. I just wanted to. I did my 26 years, and they said I was too young to retire. And I still insisted I wanted to retire.
Why? Had you had enough of going to sea?
Well, that's the part. I wanted to be with my wife and children. My children were just growing up, and I thought I should be with them. And depending on my pension, I thought I could live nicely. But they cut my pension, gave me 1/3 of my pension, because they wanted me to work till 60 years of age, and I didn't want to work till 60 years of age. That was a new ruling just brought in about 2 years before I was due to retire. So anyway, I decided to leave them, and we left Hong Kong.
And where did you decide to go?
Well, our first intention was to go to America because her mother was here, her brother was here, I had a brother here. But to get a visa would take 7 years. Even today, if you're in England, you want a visa, it'll take you 7 years. And yet we're getting all these Mexicans coming across the border by the thousands. Not that I've got against them anything to the Mexicans, but they're just coming in by the thousands. And yet people are waiting to come to this country, highly educated people, people with professions, and yet they can't come in. So I realized we couldn't come to the States. So we were going to go to England. So we went to England, and the weather was atrocious. Miserable. There's nothing worse than the English weather.
I understand that you went on a little trip before you went to England. Did you go for a trip?
Oh yeah, we stopped. We got off. First we went to. She stayed in Naples, and then she went on to Rome. I went to England. You couldn't buy a car in Hong Kong, so when I went to England, I got a car and I drove it all the way down to Rome, and then we stayed in Rome for a while.
I understand you met some interesting people.
Very, very interesting people.
Tell us about
there was a countess. She was in very poor conditions. You know, a lot of them were poor. And she took us all around Rome, places that very few tourists can see. And she took us to the Vatican, and she took us down to the Vatican Museum, which is downstairs. And very few people are allowed to get in there, to the Vatican Museum. In the Vatican, you go down, and there they had the big statue of Moses. But the Moses, they had 2 horns. I don't know why. This comes from the biblical story that when Moses came down from Mount, the tablets, the shining of God's light on him had given the impression that he had horns. And they had this beautiful statue of Moses sculptured down there. And unfortunately, we wanted to see the Sistine Chapel, but we missed it because the Pope had the hiccups. I don't know if you remember that occasion when the Pope was dying. He had the hiccups.
Hiccups.
And they closed the Sistine Chapel, so we never saw the Sistine Chapel.
But I understand you met some Americans on this trip.
Oh, yeah.
As well.
We met a big lawyer from Chicago, Holland, was his Paul Holland, and his wife. And they were sitting on deck, and my wife and I were sitting on deck, and the kids were playing around, you know. And my daughter was a small girl, and she had an apple in her hand. She dropped it and ran to the scuppers, and my wife says to her in Russian, "Go and pick up that apple." So this woman sitting next to my wife, she says, "Oh, you speak Russian?" Well, I said, "Yes, of course, I'm from Russia." And they got talking naturally, and we got introduced, and this man told us who he was. He was Paul Holland, and his son-in-law was Senator Yates. And they were very, very wealthy. So anyway, we stayed in London for a while, and we didn't like it. I couldn't get the job that I wanted to. I could get menial jobs, you know, not menial. I mean, jobs that I didn't care for.
Right.
So I thought I couldn't get a visa to stay in the United States. So I thought, well, the next thing would be Canada. So I left my wife in England. She was drawing money from my company in London. And I went to New York. I got on the bus. I was trying to conserve money. And I got to Chicago, and I thought I'd look up this Paul Holland. And he lived in a beautiful office way in the center of Chicago. I went to a small little hotel, and he treated me royally. He took me to the Jewish Country Club. It's the most gorgeous club. Took me everywhere. Took me to the Bankers Club one night. Well, he treated me really royally.
Did you explain to him your situation and that you wished?
Oh, I expect. He says, well, he said, I tell you what, he said, I've got a very good friend in San Francisco, Mr. Lurie. That's this Lurie's father. He says, Mr. Lurie and I used to sell newspapers at the corners in Chicago. That's Lurie's father. Oh. Then Lurie must have come out to San Francisco and dabbled in real estate and built up a fortune. And he says, you go and see Mr. Lurie when you get to, he said, he'll probably get you a job there. And I said, well, what about my immigration papers? Oh, he said, I know a very good commissioner of immigration in in San Francisco. He said, you go and see him, tell him my name. He shows us the connections, you know.
Sure.
He said, I'm sure if it's possible for him to help you, he'll help you. So one night, he says, I can't take you out tonight, I'm sorry. He said, apologizing to me, he can't take me out. He's a multimillionaire and he's a pauper. He said, I tell you what, you go and see a show, a stage show. I'm trying to think of the name of this actress.
Carol, I think when we just Carol Channing by any chance? Was it Carol Channing that you went to see? The actress? No, was someone else?
She's still acting now. She was on the stage, so he picked up the phone and he said, I'd like to have a ticket for the show tonight. And apparently on the other side, the fellow said, sorry, we're all full. Well, he says, by the way, he says, my name is Mr. Holland. Oh, yes. I said, so I got a ticket and I went to the show. It was a beautiful show, stage show. It's the best seat right in front. So anyway, I told him I had to leave. I couldn't stay any longer. So he gave me this introduction to Lurie here. That's this Lurie's father and the immigration. So I went to Lurie, but I could see he wasn't interested. So I forgot all about it. And I went to see the immigration. He took me in, sat down, talked to me like a Dutch uncle. And went through all my papers and things like that. Then he says, no, he says, I'm sorry. I said, you have to wait. He says, he was most apologetic, so he's doing me a favor, you know, that he couldn't help get me to stay in the country. He says, if you could stay another year or so, he said, I'll probably be able to get you. He says, something in your papers that I can't do it, you see. So I said, well, there's nothing I can do. So I said, okay, then my next move is up to Canada. So I got on a bus and up to Vancouver. And of course, I knew a lot of people, the people I worked with who retired in Canada from my company. So I went to see a very good friend of mine. And he lived in Westminster, just a suburb of Vancouver. So I phoned him up and he says, come over for dinner. So I went for dinner. We sat down talking. I told him my situation. I said, I can't get to the States until I get a visa, but I said, in the meantime, I don't mind living in Canada. I said, do you know anybody who can give me a job? Well, he says, phone me up tomorrow. He says, I'll see what I can do for you. So I phoned out tomorrow. He said, well, if you want a job going to sea up to Alaska, running between Vancouver and Alaska, he says, it's a second engineer. He says, it's good pay. And I said, no, I don't want to go to sea. I said, so it ended up, I stayed in the YMCA, and then all of a sudden it came to me, I'll phone up this fellow Holland in Chicago. Maybe he can pull some strings. So I phoned him up, and I says, if you know anybody in Canada that can help me out, get a job. Well, he says, phone me up tomorrow night, see what I can do for you. So I phoned him up the next night, and he says to me, I got a cousin working in a brand new big mining job. They're going to start a big mine at a place called Atikokan. It's not very far from Port Arthur, north of Port Arthur. I said, he says, I'll contact him, and then I'll contact you, and then you can phone him up. So he contacted him. Apparently they were looking for engineers. So he phoned me up, and he says, yes, he said, my cousin says if you get to him, stay in the hotel in Atikokan, phone him up, and he'll come and see you, and then he'll check you out whether you're suitable for the job. So off I went. Usual bus ride, right across Canada. And I got there and stayed in the motel. Small little town, small mining town, 3,000 population, about 2/3 children. So we stayed in this town and motel, and he came up to see me. He says, yeah, I think we can do with you. Your services would be, you sort of qualify. I said, fine. How much to pay? He said, well, we'll give you $500. In those days, $500 was
a fortune.
It was a fortune.
It really was.
We could live on $150, and we lived high. So I said, fine. But he said, we don't have any quarters for you, but we built little shacks. We put all our engineers in it. They're very comfortable, heated, and 2 in the shack. And he says, there's a commissary. You eat all your food there for nothing. You can have 3 steaks if you want to. And I tell you, the food was out of this world. And In the meantime, I was saving some money, and I told my wife to stay in London until I had enough money to pay for the passage across.
So she had to wait anyways because there wasn't accommodations for,
That's right.
for her.
There was no, plus the fact there was no accommodation. So when they started building homes for the senior staff, so I said when they were just about ready, I told her that sent the passage money so she could come. But she said she had to go to San Francisco to see her mother and brothers. I said, fine, no problem. So she came, she went to Chicago, met this man again. He was very nice to her, took him out that evening, and then from then on they came to San Francisco. They stayed there for about 2 weeks. She stayed with her mother, and happy reunion. And then she came up to Canada. Mm-hmm. I brought her up to Canada, but...
How did she like it, living in this town?
In Canada?
Yes.
Oh, I enjoyed it. The crowd is very nice. A small little place. We were busy. Of course, construction, we were building big dredges.
And your wife enjoyed the life there?
Then when they built the homes, she came. I put her in a hotel for about a week because we had no furniture, so I wanted her to choose the furniture. So we got down to Port Arthur, and we spent $6,000. Bought the complete 3 bedrooms, you name them, everything. Carpets, kitchenware, kitchen stove, Frigidaire, washing machine, washing dryer. So we gave this man about $2,000, and we told him we'd pay him the rest slowly. So it was quite agreeable. So we stayed, and there was no social life. You made your own entertainment, Every Friday, Saturday night was a party. So every family used to make a party. And that was my wife's party. Well, she was a wonderful cook. She was a terrific cook. She'd make Russian dishes, and all the other wives used to bring either a cake or a salad, or and of course they used to bring the bottles of whiskey, and we used to sing and dance till about 2 and 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning every Saturday. That was the only entertainment we had. But during the week, the women used to get together to have knitting circles. My wife was a wonderful crochet. She was a wonderful embroidery. She was really very, very talented. She used to make flowers, roses, you name them, and you had to come near them to smell it, to think that they're genuine. She was terrific. And,
how long did you stay with
well, we stayed there 3 years. No, 2.5 years. I stayed there. I was due an increase in pay, and he wouldn't give it to me. They promised me $700 after a year and a half. And for some reason or other, the other man on the other dredge, he got it. And his downtime was, you see, downtime was $2,000 an hour. When the thing shut down for 5 hours, that's $10,000. Well, he had more downtime than I have because he didn't know how to run his crew and he didn't know how to run the machinery properly. So when I thought, well, I was due an increase, I'd go up and see him and ask him why wasn't I given an increase. I known that the other man had got an increase. And so I went up. He said, no, he says, I'm not going to give you an increase. He said, I said, why? I told him, my downtime is minimal. I said, my crew are very happy. I said, maintenance is minimal. No, he says, I'm not going to give you. So I thought, well, nothing I could do about it. Money was enough to live on, but I was due an increase, you see. So I mulled it over in my mind, and I decided, well, I'll write to the head office in Chicago. Inland Steel. So I wrote a letter explaining my situation and explaining what conditions were like. And a week later I got a letter, and he got a copy of the letter that I got. And I was informing him that I had wrote to Chicago and that the man on the job decides whether I should get an increase in pay or not, whether I deserved it. So I got called up there, and he said, I'm not going to give you an increase. He says, I see you've written above my head to the head office. I said, well, you gave me no option. I said, I was due an increase. I was producing. And I said, why should the other man get an increase and I don't get an increase? So he said, well, I'm not going to give you an increase. So I came home very dejected. My wife could see I was very, very miserable. And this was playing up on me. I was feeling really, getting sick from that sort of attitude. So the wife says, oh, let's go to the States. I said, how are we going to the States? Well, she said, let's go to Winnipeg. So I
There was an American consulate in Winnipeg.
Yeah. In the meantime, my daughter was in Winnipeg. You see, there was no high school, so she went to high school in Winnipeg. Then she got a job there. She didn't want to go to college. And every week, she'd send her laundry down by train.
For Mama to do.
To Mama to do it. And the next night, we put on the train, goes back again.
Yes.
She got friendly with the train conductor. So that was all free, you see. And so my daughter's a waggler. So anyway, we went at the American consulate there, fill up the paper, and they usually ask the usual question, well, have you ever been a communist? And ask the woman, have you ever been a prostitute? You know,
my.
Of course, my wife turned red. You know. And we filled up the necessary papers, and he says, well, I'll give you a call when your application comes back from Washington. So he came back, he says, no, he said, as you're a British subject, he said, it'll take about 5 or 6 years before you get a visa. So we kept talking. I said, look here, I says, there must be some means of circumventing this. So he thought, he says, by the way, he says, your wife is a refugee, a Russian refugee from Russia. Well, he says, that's no problem. He says, we can get you within a month. But he says, you got to go as a husband of a refugee. See, so I said, it doesn't matter how I go.
As long as I go.
As long as I go. So he laughed. So he says, anyway, he says, you go back again to Adicoke, and he says, when I'll make it, fill up the new application for you, and then we'll see what happens. Sure enough, about a month later, he called me, said I got a letter to come up. So we came up, and he says, okay, he said, we've got your number, your immigration number to go to the States. And he says, you've got a month. You know, with a month, you must get out of here. He said, if not, you lose your quota number. He said, because a lot of people are waiting. He said, I said, no worry about that. So we got down, we were very happy. So we got down to Adicoke, and we were trying to sell all our stuff back at half price, but nobody wanted to buy it. You know, they wanted to pay for minimum nothing. So I said to my wife, I said, you know, I said, we've spent about $6,000. We've hardly used it. And so it's like new, because, you know, she's so particular, so meticulous cleanliness, you know. I said, I tell you what, we'll call some carrier to take it down. So we called Mayflower. Mayflower came up, and how much it cost. I know they overcharged us. Shouldn't be more than about $700, but they charged us $1,000. But they says they wanted payment on the barrelhead when we got to San Francisco before they released the. So lucky we had the money. So.
And you went to San Francisco. Now tell me upon your arrival in San Francisco.
Well, we arrived in San Francisco, and we located an apartment on 16th Avenue in Richmond with a Russian family. The Russian family lived downstairs, and we lived upstairs. We paid them $100 a month. And of course, her family thought I was very wealthy when I arrived, which I wasn't. But I had to start somewhere to get some money, you see. So every morning I used to get hold of the paper, and I used to look for the jobs, mark them down, and 7 o'clock I'd get on the streetcar, get into town, and by 9 o'clock I'd call at the different companies, and oh, fine, yes, you're just the man we want, you just qualify, you've got this experience and know-how and things like that. And you fill up this form, application form, your qualifications, etc. So I used to fill them up, you know, the usual thing. And at the bottom says, the last line says, are you an American citizen? And I said, not yet. I've just emigrated. Will apply for my citizenship after 5 years. So the secretary should take it into the boss, and he'd come out, sorry, we can't give you a job, you're not an American citizen. But I says, I'm an immigrant, I've come in here to be a citizen. I said, what's the difference? No, sorry, we can't give you a job. This is to go out from job to job. I could have had a beautiful job in Manila, the big sugar refinery there.
So how did it finally come out? Were you able to get a position?
Well, I got desperate, money was getting short, and I went to an employment agency, gave them my credentials, and told them when I had a job there. I went to 2-3 employment agencies, put in my papers, And one day this girl phoned me up. Oh, she says, we've got a job for you. What kind of a job we don't know, we've got a job for you. They're looking for engineers. I was fine. So I went to the office and she says, oh, this place is Boardman Place. 40 Boardman Place. Now, where is Boardman Place? Of course, today it's a police station, the Hall of Justice in San Francisco. That's where Boardman Place used to be all empty. In those days, there was no Hall of Justice. It was just empty land. So eventually I went to a policeman, where's Boardman Place? He says, I don't know where Boardman Place is. So gradually I found this Boardman Place and I looked at this Cohen company. So I looked at I had to go up the stairs to the office up there and looked dirty and filthy. And I said, I couldn't imagine they'd give a job there. So I turned it down. I didn't go up there. I went home. In the meantime, I was still going and looking for jobs. But out of nil desperandum, I decided, well, money's too. I have to go where I want or not, even if they give me $200 a month. So I went there and walked up the stairs. And there was the secretary there. She was gruff. What do you want? I said, I'm looking for a job. Oh, she said, who sent you? I said, the employment agency. Oh, fine. Fill up this form. So I filled up the form, told her I was chief engineer. I'd been to sea. I'd been doing all kinds of things. So she took it up to the boss. The boss wasn't the boss. That was the son's boss. He just graduated from Stanford. He was a tall, skinny fellow. So she went in, came back. So he came back and come in, he says. So I went in and he says, well, we're just looking for a man like your type. He said, with marine engineering knowledge, that was fine. He said, I tell you what, we're going to give you $500 a month. Would that be enough? I said, that's more than enough. I said, more than enough.
You were delighted.
Well, the rent was $100. We had $400 to spend, you see.
And did you stay with this company long?
Well, first he said, before you accept the job, he says, I want you to make sure that you want the job.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it. So he said, I'm going to send an engineer with you to look at the various jobs that we have, so that in case you like that type of job. So I said, well, okay, fine. So at 10 o'clock he sent one of the engineers with me, senior engineer, and we went around to different plants and looked at it. And then we went to the Fisherman's Wharf, had a big lunch. I had 3 beers instead of the normal one, so it's all being paid for. Had a lovely fish dinner. And we came back. I says, yes, I'll take the job. So I stayed with them 26 years, 27 years, 26 and a half years, actually.
I think that was a very successful appointment.
Oh, very. They were very happy with me. I traveled all over the world for them. A lot of the other engineers didn't want to travel. They didn't want to go overseas. So I was the one delegated to go overseas. I'd be going to Rio de Janeiro, I'd be going to Peru, I'd go to Guatemala, I'd go to Brazil, I'd go to Mexico, you name them, I've been all over. And then I went overseas to Israel on a job, to Iraq, to Iran, to Portugal,
everywhere.
And all over Canada. So I was the overseas man, so I got all the other jobs. So I left them, and now I'm working on my own.
In many respects, when we discussed this, you've led a very charmed life. Were there moments of your life when you came close to dying, but somehow you were mysteriously spared?
I'm a fatalist. What's to be, to be. No, really, I'm a fatalist. What happens, happens. I've lived a very charmed life, I must say.
Tell us of some of these occurrences.
They say the good die young, we could live a long time. I said, the good Lord must have been good to me.
Very, very good to you. I understand you had quite a few incidences where you
I've
came
had quite a few incidents. One was a ship I was on in Hong Kong Harbor. I went out, we arrived after a long trip, and I thought I'd go on the town and have a good time, and I came back drunk. And it was a hot, sultry night in Hong Kong. You can't imagine how hot it can get there. I had 2 fans in my room, and that wasn't enough to keep me cool, so I pulled my blanket out and I put it on the deck. Clean decks, of course, we were up in the officers' quarters. Went to sleep, and it poured with rain. I never even woke up. That shows how drunk I was. Ended up with pneumonia.
Oh, dear.
I was rushed to the hospital, and they put another engineer and replaced him with another man, and the ship went when I came out of hospital after 20 days, I joined another ship. Of course, you never join the same ship. And that ship disappeared in a storm off the coast of Japan.
The one that you should have been on
I should have been on. So the good Lord must have made me sick.
Just to keep you safe?
To keep me safe. So that ship went down with all hands, no survivors, off the coast of Japan in a storm. They call them typhoons there. Here it's known as hurricanes. So the ship completely disappeared. So So I was saved that time. And the other time, I think I was nearly killed by Chinese.
How did that happen?
During the Chinese, the British at that time ruled China, ruled Shanghai, and there was a lot of uprising, the Chinese against the British. And they surrounded the police station, and the British that were in the police station felt they were hemmed in by the crowd. They opened fire and killed about 12 or 13 Chinese. And this made the Chinese mad as hell, and they were going to take revenge. And one day, I happened to be in uniform. We were sort of a home guard, if you might call them, you know. We did volunteer duty, protecting different British officers. And I was coming home from duty, and it was getting a little bit dark. And I was about maybe 100 yards away from home, and this fellow came with an axe, a sharp axe, and he meant to hit me on the head and split my head, but he missed my head and hit my back. And he ran. By the time I turned around and pulled my gun out, he disappeared. Although I fired a couple of shots, I couldn't get him. I went home, and my mother was terrified, of course. I had a big gash in my back, and I was bleeding. My mother ripped the shirt off, and she was getting nervous, and I said, call the doctor. But she said, let me try and stop the blood. So she went along and got some flour from the kitchen. Well, it didn't stop the blood really, but it cut her back a little bit. Meantime, she called the doctor, and the English doctor came along, and he said, we'll have to put some stitches. I said, well, do we have to stitch? Well, let's go to the hospital. He says, no, he says, hang on to the bedpost. Oh yeah, I hung up a grim death, and he put about 4 stitches or 5 stitches in my back.
Oh dear.
Anyway, it was painful. What could you do? Then he sewed it up, and I was all right.
But you lived through it again.
I lived through it. And then when I joined Cohen here, I was doing a job at the airport. Not airport, the United Airlines steam plant. There's 2 brand new boilers, and I started them from scratch. And everything was running all right. And checked them all out, and everything was running beautiful. And I said to the engineer, I said, well, I'll give it one more run before I tell you it's yours. Then you can sign the paper. Well, apparently what happened was when they put the new gas line, the big, huge gas line for the boilers there, they didn't blow it out and clean the dust and welding beads and things out of it. And I must have fired that ball about 50 times, and over time all that dust and things was accumulating. And it got where the valve closes, it didn't close because there's a lot of dust and all kinds of things preventing the valve from fully closing, and it was leaking gas into the boiler. And so I was telling this engineer, he was standing next to me, I said, well, I said, you'll go the final round? I said, you sign my papers. I said, here's my papers right here. So I said, we'll put it through its paces. So we started it up, pushed the button to light off, and boom. Normally I stand right where it's up watching the flame. But this time, for some reason or other, I stood aside. And that big, huge door weighing about 50 pounds was blown about 60 feet, hit the wall.
Again, a charmed life. I think that's an apropos statement.
And the whole area, they just come out of one hour. What happened? The explosion was so terrific. There was a man on top of the boiler. He got blown out.
Oh my God!
But he wasn't badly hurt.
As the years in San Francisco passed, your children were growing up and forging careers of their own. I know you have a son, William. What profession did he pursue?
Well. He wanted to be a pharmacist because all his uncles were pharmacists, see? But then I don't want to go into too detail about it because he'd get mad at me. So eventually we switched over to being a podiatrist. So I said, well, he met a friend who also wanted to be a podiatrist, so another school fellow, friend of his. So they went to college. And I told my son, I said, look here, I said, I can't afford to put you to college. I said, every month I have to borrow, every semester, I have to borrow from the bank, you see, and then pay them. By the time the semester ends, I paid them, you see, now I start borrowing again. So I said, if you're going to play around in college, I said, your mother and I denying ourselves to put you through college, so you better get down to it. And he did.
He did. Is he now a practicing podiatrist?
He's a very successful podiatrist. One time he was president of the Podiatry Association, but he left them for some reason or other. There was something he didn't think was quite right with them, so he left them. And now he's got 3 offices.
That's wonderful.
One in San Francisco, one in Oakland, and one in San Jose. And he commutes to all 3 of them, and he's got quite a very good practice.
How many children does he have?
Well, 2, and 1 passed away, 3. My wife wanted another one.
No, how many children does your son William have?
Oh, William, well, he had, from his first wife, he had 3. Edward, Michelle, and Maddie. And they're divorced. Then he married again. Now he's got 2. He's got a red-headed boy.
How lovely.
And he just got a baby girl. She weighed about 4 pounds. A little, tiny little tot. She's about 2 months old now. So.
Tell me about your daughter, Sophie. What kind of a profession did she pursue?
Well, Sophie became a secretary. She worked for law firms. And she's a very go-ahead type of girl, you know.
What is she doing now?
Well, she got tired of being a secretary, and she thought she'd go on her own, start a secretarial service. Her first secretarial service wasn't too successful, so she bought a phone answering service. And started very small, and with my help, she managed to build it up, and she's got a terrific answering service. And she's wanted to increase it to, she's got 6 girls working for her, and she wants to expand. She's not only just answering service, I don't know exactly what to call it, but if anybody wants to has a report, or doctors want to make a special report, or lawyers want to they can phone in through the telephone and the tape, and she takes the tape and gives it to this. She has a typist, a secretarial office. The girl types it for them and send it to them. So she's doing very well. She wants to expand. She's very ambitious.
Did Sophie have children as well?
Yes, she's got 3 boys. I said 2 boys and a girl. My grandson?
Yes.
Robert.
Robert. And how old is Robert?
Robert's, he'll be 21, I think, another year. He does very well.
Jason, I know, is her youngest child.
Yeah.
What stands out in your mind about him?
Jason, he has good qualities, Jason. And of course, Sharon, she's out of this world.
I know that your first grandchild was Sharon. Tell me, what did Hannah say to you when she first saw Sharon, when she was first born?
Oh, Sharon was, not because I'm prejudiced, she was a really most beautiful baby. She was born with about that much blonde hair when she was born. And first, my wife and I saw her. We looked at, the nurse brought her to the window, you know, and we looked at her, and the first words my grandmother said, she said, I wish I'd be alive to see her married. That was her only ambition.
Tell me about Sharon's wedding. I know she got married several years ago, and I understand it was an outstanding event.
Well, Sharon's wedding was out of this world. Of course, they put a very, very big party, tremendous big party. They had the wedding at the Fairmont. They had hundreds of people, partly business people of theirs on her side. And of course, we were the small side of the family, so, and it goes beyond description. Everything was laid on, and the wedding was out of this world.
9 months ago, Sharon gave birth to your first great-grandchild, Adam. Mm-hmm. As you look at Adam, with the wealth of your life experience behind you, what advice would you give him with regards to leading a life as satisfactory as your own? Well,
I could only give Adam, who knows, his character may change from, different people have different characters, you know. Well, I can give him the same, what I told you about myself.
Work hard.
Never harm anybody. If you don't like anybody, just go away. Don't take any dope. And there's no free lunches. There's no free lunches. Everything you got to do, you got to work for. I told my grandchildren the same thing. what you put in, you take out.
Joe, to many people, enduring one major uprooting in a lifetime is a great achievement. As your story unfolded, we were witness to your early years in China, your war experiences which separated you from your family, their internment in Japanese war camps, and your departure from the Merchant Marines, a job you had held for 26 years. As if these milestones were not enough, at age 50, when most men would have lacked the courage to seek new frontiers, you emigrated with your family, first to England, then to Canada, and finally to the United States, where you once more established yourself successfully. We thank you for sharing so many of your life experiences with us. Good night.
Thank you.